Okay, on today's Manna Machine Alert, we have got something really, really exciting. We are going to be talking about the Ophel Pithos on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, so today what we've got is a really, really fascinating article from Daniel Vainstub, and it's published in the 2023 volume of the Jerusalem Journal of Archaeology.
And I know a lot of our listeners have no idea what you said.
Yep.
To start with.
Okay.
So, explaining.
Okay, let's tear this down, and because it has got a fascinating connection to something that many biblical scholars think is a myth, which is the visit by the Queen of Sheba. So, you want to listen to this one. This one is really great.
This article, by the way, is very long, very detailed, very well written.
Yeah, it's very well written.
So I'm almost as excited as David is to present this to you.
Yeah, this one is fascinating. Now, what it has to do with is called an inscription called the Ophel Pithos, or Pithoi. Now, we'll break down what all that means, okay? In 2012, there was an excavation done in Jerusalem, basically outside the Temple Mount, in a place called the Ophel. It's between the Temple Mount and the city of David. And they found in this particular place several fragments of pithoi, or pithos, which is a kind of wine jug or jar. Okay? On one of these, they found an inscription along the collar of the jar, a fragmentary inscription. Now, this is not new. This is a very famous inscription. And so far, 11 attempts have been done to try to translate this unsuccessfully. But Vainstub here has offered a provocative, and I think correct, reading of the text.
And he offers a lot of support for his very novel analysis.
Yeah, it is very novel, but it's well supported, and I think, given what he offers here, is the best reading I've seen so far.
He starts off mentioning that the interpretation of all the others all had one thing in common. They all presupposed it was Canaanite.
Mm-hmm. And that's the assumption he's challenging in the article. Now, let's get into a little bit of the background here of this. The Ophel, which is between the city of David and to the south and the Temple Mount in the north, had a dump of ceramics. And excavators went through that, as I said, in 2012. And they found 7 of these pithoi. And they were about 80 meters to the south of the southern wall of the Temple Mount. So really, really close to the Temple Mount. They have been securely dated.
So no one questions the date.
No one questions the date of this. And he puts it at early Iron Age 2A2, which is the mid-10th century BC. Now, to put this in context of biblical history, this is the time of Solomon.
So everyone's in agreement. This excavation site is found during the time of Solomon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everyone is in agreement on that. What's at odds here is the translation. And that is, I think, the strongest aspect of this article. Now, what his suggestion is, which I think is really interesting, is that it was written in ancient South Arabian. He identifies the script as ancient South Arabian, and the language is Sabaean. Now, for those of you who don't know what Sabaean or Saba is, it's better known in your Bibles as Sheba. Okay? as in the Queen of Sheba. And how he arrives at this is really fascinating. Now, he has a picture in his article, and I'll be putting up pictures as we go along here in the transcription.
His pictures were really excellent.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I did do before getting on the air here is I looked at his hypothesis really carefully and to see if this thing had legs, because it is a pretty remarkable finding if true. We should note that this article has already been heavily vetted. It made the American Schools of Overseas Research top 10 list of discoveries for 2023. While the author does hedge his language a lot, which is normal for academics to do, I think he's nailed it.
Yeah, and as you said, it is a very creative, out-of-the-box thinking, but it's backed by impeccable research.
Yeah.
So we've come across a lot of very creative people whose research left a lot to be desired.
Yeah.
So this guy really not only has a novel approach, it's so detailed, backed up, it'll make your eyes swim. Or at least it made my eyes swim. So
now, one of the things he notes is that one of the problems with the Canaanite interpretation is the orthography of the inscription.
Which would make a lot of sense if it's the wrong language.
It would, yes. If it's the wrong character set, yeah. It'd make a lot of sense. But what he did was, instead of assuming it was Canaanite, he assumed it was Old Arabian. And what I did was I double-checked this. I have a copy of Beeston's Old Arabian Grammar. And I actually went into that grammar and checked out the orthography myself. And it looks good. I have to admit, this really checks out. Now, the two principal characters that, and I'll put up the annotated here as well, is the flat D and the round H or the 5. Okay? Those are two letters that cannot be accounted for by Proto-Sinaitic script. So early alphabetic script can't account for this. But there is characters of this shape in Old Arabian. So those two letters really have put the nail in the coffin here. It's a very, very interesting inscription too, because it reads, the first two letters are a shin and a yod, and we don't exactly know what that is. It's probably the final suffix of some verb, but we're not sure exactly which. But there you have a lamed, a flat D, and a nun, which is laudanum, which is incense. The next character which is reconstructed is a round H, but that's an abbreviation in Sabaean for the number 5.
And the number 5 had its own significance if this is indeed what the author thinks it is.
Yes, if the author is right here, this is one of those sorts of jars that holds 5 ephah of contents, basically 110 to 120 liters. So this is really an interesting reading, that 5 or round H is not something that can be accounted for in Paleo-Hebrew or early Canaanite script.
Yeah, if you assume it's a completely different language, Sabaean,
yeah,
all those things just very neatly fall into place.
It very neatly falls into place. Now, the implications of this are phenomenal. Now, the first thing we need to understand is this is a locally manufactured jar. Okay, so it was made near Jerusalem. The second thing is the inscription was written on the jar while the jar was still unfired.
He goes into great detail, pointing out the difference between there's a monument form of carving and then there's a smaller form of carving. And when it's in a monument form, it's very hard, right-edged letters
Mm-hmm.
because you're carving in stone.
I can put an example of monumental old Arabian up for them to see if they want to see that.
And he was saying that some of the discrepancies that come with saying this is Sabaean come from the fact that they're carving in very soft, wet clay.
Yeah. And most of the examples we have of Sabaean are on sticks. Basically little pieces of wood that are painted on. So the few examples that we have of, say, clay inscriptions for Sabaean are actually found on incense burners, which interestingly enough have this word laudanum. Of the 11 that have been recovered, 2 of them are in Sabaean, and 1 is in Katabanic, which is another dialect of ancient South Arabian. But what's interesting is all of these inscriptions appear on incense burners.
Yeah, all of them. So that would lend credence to his theory.
Yeah, it lends a lot of credence to his theory. And laudanum is actually a kind of incense. Now, he has identified it as the incense of the Cistus ladaniferus tree. So he thinks it's the equivalent of, say, the Shekelet of Exodus 30:34. So that incense. And it's one of 4 ingredients for the holy incense.
He also mentions with the name of the word that substance was mixed in with other aromatics. And there's 8 aromatics whose names are written on the burners, along with the laudanum, and most of which can be identified by their Hebrew parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really fascinating to me is there is a Arabic lexicography that identified it as also a type of medicine. It's used when mixed in with honey wine, and then it's applied on scars.
Okay.
And it removes the scars. But what was interesting is it's a type of medicine that's said to stick to the hair and beards of goats when they eat certain plants. So this is how we know it's the substance.
All right.
Not the plants. And that was kind of important as well.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not talking about just a type of tree.
Right.
You're talking about the substance, which is made from the plants and the trees.
Mm-hmm.
So that further emphasizes all these were found on incense burners.
Right.
So it's not just the leaves of a tree or a particular plant.
Mm-hmm.
It's the substance.
Okay. I think as far as what I found was really fascinating about this is that implication, getting back to that implication, that this was somebody who was living in Jerusalem who was working with a local potter to make these jars. And that person knew Sabaean. Now, in the 5th century, this might not be so radical an idea. But we're talking about the 10th century BC, the time of Solomon. Now, what makes this so interesting from a biblical perspective is when you start looking at it compared to 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles 9, which talks about the trade agreements that Solomon forged with his neighboring nations. And one of those was with the Queen of Sheba. Now, for a long, long time, scholars have regarded this encounter as a myth. Basically, they have said that, oh no, the Queen of Sheba would never go on a diplomatic mission. Well, first of all, we have to point out that the text doesn't say the Queen of Sheba. That's an English translation.
It says a Queen of Sheba.
It says a Queen of Sheba. Yes.
And they were not notoriously monogamous back then.
Kings in the ancient times were not monogamous. So this is probably not the great queen of the King of Sheba, but probably one of his minor queens. who's being sent as a diplomatic attaché. So, in that particular case, it might not be so remarkable. She's going to be surrounded by guards. And basically, they're going, and she's starting a diplomatic trade agreement. Because those whole chapters of 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9 is talking not about, say, some fantastic encounter, but all the trade agreements that Solomon is forging. Because it not only talks about his trade agreements with Arabia, but also with Hiram, king of Tyre. Solomon, in these passages, is setting up those trade agreements, and this is how the trade agreement begins. So the fact that we have a Sabaean speaker living in Jerusalem, writing about incense, and the passages in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles talks about the incense that's being brought into Jerusalem. So this gives archaeological warrant for these passages. And I think that is really interesting and really exciting.
And again, Josephus is not our favorite source.
No.
But he does quote that Josephus stated that the first of these plants came to Israel from the kingdom of Sheba during Solomon's reign as a gift to the king.
Yeah.
But then they started being grown there in a region that was similar to the climate of Sheba.
Yeah.
So this would indicate not just a one-time trade gift, but
Yes.
an ongoing, semi-permanent relationship.
Yeah. But it's not a long-lived relationship. Basically, with the conquest of Shishak, that relationship comes to an end. Because at that point, Jerusalem becomes a lot more insular and can no longer continue to have that trade relationship. So we are stuck here in a very sort of pocket of time here between the 11th and 10th centuries. So overall, I mean, this thing is fascinating. Because, again, the takeaways of this is it's Sabaean. It's basically a Sabaean inscription, and it's the earliest Sabaean inscription found that far north, which is an interesting thing all by itself. It's, once you look at the orthography and you compare it to Sabaean, yeah, it's Sabaean. And since it is Sabaean, it would be talking about incense, which Solomon did receive a bunch of during this period of time. The inscription is well provenanced.
Mm-hmm.
So the age is not contested, and it gives archaeological warrant to the whole trade that Jerusalem had with Sheba, and even makes it possible that a queen from Sheba visited Jerusalem. It gives the story new credibility. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
He simply adds that finding his inscription marks the starting point of what was a lengthy supply line.
Yeah.
Between Sheba and the temple at Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So this would have marked, and he says, tells us a lot about the geopolitical implications.
Mm-hmm.
That the temple in Jerusalem would be, while not dependent, would have gotten very comfortably reliant on its relationship with Sheba until, as you said, it was ended.
That wouldn't surprise me, because the temple at Jerusalem would have gone through vast quantities of incense.
So it would make sense to have a permanent resident of Sheba staying in Jerusalem, helping them make the incense.
Helping them at least facilitate the flow of goods. Because you'd have then possibly a bilingual agent living in Jerusalem, talking to the traders on the camels, and then, sending them back with reciprocal trade goods from Judah itself.
But again, working with the people, the potter making the jars to house the incense.
Yeah.
And that's what he's saying this inscription is.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really great place to end it. As I said, this is an exciting discovery. as I said, it made Azor's top 10 list of discoveries of 2023, and I can see why. This is a important new reading. And it also hammers home the thing, too, that new readings on old discoveries can make radical differences.
As long as they are backed by impeccable scholarship.
Yep. And I think Daniel Vainstub here has done that.
He's done an excellent job.
Yeah. You're really impressed by even the bibliography on this thing.
5-page bibliography.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got that in my note. References, 5 pages.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly well done article. And this is not an easy area to be proficient at. They're easy to read. It's not easy to keep up on the scholarship of it.
Reading it correctly, if this is correct, lends credence to the historicity of the Bible as the Bible states.
As it purports it, yes.
Yes.
Not how we fantasize it, but how it's purported.
It would be a big hit to biblical minimalism.
Yeah, this is another hit to biblical minimalism, yeah. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. A fascinating discovery by an excellent peer-reviewed article. And we wanted to bring this to you as a Manna Machine alert so you guys can get this straight goods. So anyway, we want to thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this and learned something. And we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.